So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another custom scenario that was sent to me by Tommy the Wise, though maybe made by someone else, I'm not entirely sure. The Womb Raider did get in contact with me recently, at least from the time of recording, where one of the maps sent by Tommy was made by him and someone else, but I'm not exactly sure which one he was referring to. It could be this one. I am a little bit concerned about this one because it's a giant cityscape and the frame rate is a little bit wobbly within its walls, and I think this is because the sheer amount of structures and, as a result, fences that are also involved in this, which seem to be one of the main causes for what used to be crashing in previous versions of the game. Now, I don't think we'll see that be too much of a problem here, but this settlement is obviously vast. In many ways, while it is a siege battle, it's going to take place entirely within this massive settlement. Choke points are going to be important for the defenders still, and exactly where they choose to make their stands are going to be important. This is going to be a Dol Amroth themed defence, and their enemies are all around them. I don't know which settlement of Dol Amroth this would be. There are only so many to choose from after all. This would appear to be a little bit more of a residential and civilian settlement than anything overly militarised, shall we say. But yes, it's going to be another one of these as well, which starts almost immediately, in typical fashion it seems now, for one of the battles that Tommy does send in. There is no deployment phase, so it gets right underway straight away, and it does tend to be a rather fast and furious affair as well, and considering how large this battle is and how undoubtedly chaotic it's going to be, we are once again going to have to make liberal use, I'm sure, of the half-speed feature, but we'll go through the attacking armies first and foremost, starting off over here with 2x, who's going to be playing as a Haradrim force. Pretty good, I'd say, against Dol Amroth, certainly against their overlords in Gondor. Dol Amroth do have the capabilities, more natural capabilities anyway, of dealing with more lightly armoured and lightly defended units like the ones Harad tend to traffic in, but the armour piercing is still very much going to be a useful facet of the Haradrim roster. Like with most of the Western Kingdoms, Dol Amroth do have a certain reliance on armour. Southron Warband represent one of the lower tier options for armour piercing, but as far as a basic spear goes, as far as they do have obvious deficiencies in terms of their equipment and keeping themselves alive and base damage values, especially with that spear malice in play, the armour piercing does make up for a good deal of that, especially when they're up against the appropriate enemies, and that is certainly going to be the case here. A couple of units of them. Just in behind, we've got some dismounted Serpent Guard without the armour upgrade as they are here, but they're still going to be a match for equivalent Dol Amroth units on this occasion, and indeed in terms of having a little bit, more of a focus around slightly better melee defense than other units in its class for its cost, and a little bit more damage perhaps as well at the base. Maybe they do have more in common with some of the higher end Dol Amroth units as a result of that, though maybe not with quite the same level of damage output, but we'll get onto that, I'm sure, when we move through the Dol Amroth roster. A couple of units of them. Southron Archers, as with most of these rather quick battles that we have seen from Tommy of late, Southron Archers and basic archers of their type don't tend to have enough time to do a lot of damage over a longer period of time, so really it's going to be more of a surgical strike that's required from this kind of unit. They may not be overly impressive when it comes to their damage dealing potential, but they certainly still have something to offer, and again, key is going to be who they choose to target down. Dol Amroth do have a few unshielded units which would be ripe for the picking, but heavily armoured as many of their units tend to be as well. Lower end archers like this do tend to have a little bit of a hard time in doing damage quickly, so we'll see how they get on. Southron Pikemen are one of those units which, in certain circumstances, can be one of the most efficient units in the entire game because they are a unit of pikes that have armour piercing. However, very specific circumstances need to be true for that to be the case. If their formation is buckled, their very low stats means they're going to get cut down very, very quickly. And also they of course have pretty woeful defence against any sort of ranged attack. Even the most basic archer can lay them to waste pretty quickly, so you do need to use them well if you want to get the absolute most out of them, but they're cheap enough to the point where they can be used like any standard unit of lower end pikes, and that will be useful here. They won't be able to dig in based on the length of the battle and play the long game, but they can certainly anchor the Haradrim push as they move forward. Pretty much the opposite effect is going to be had by the Mumakil here. They are going to be charging through lines, causing chaos, As this is still the old version of Third Age Reforged as we are speaking now, the Mumakils still don't have the boosts which are going to come to large monstrous units like this in the upcoming patch to make them a little bit more usable, not to the point of being overpowered. I think if it goes that way, it's honestly more of a problem for the game, because we know what this kind of unit can be like from previous versions of Reforged. When they are overpowered, they're kind of unstoppable. However, as it stands, they are very difficult to use, though not impossible. We have seen it done, and they are still going to be useful here because, after all, when it comes to dealing quick damage and trying to really get in and amongst Dol Amroth, the Mumakil are going to be very useful for that. Based on the space that is afforded to everyone within this settlement as well, something like the Black Serpents could also prove to be very, very useful indeed. Very quick, very devastating off the charge as well, maybe not quite as tanky as other units of multiple HP cavalry, as a result of slightly lower armor values than equivalent units, and the shield value is also not quite as high. But they're still tanky enough to take a beating, and obviously the main attraction is going to be the high charge damage they're capable of dishing out. We've got some Hashari first and foremost as well with their throwing daggers. The dancing sword effect that they still have in this version of the game has of course been fixed in the upcoming new patch. And yeah, difficult class of unit to use in this version of the game, Assassins, though they are still capable of dishing out damage fairly quickly, and that is going to be all important in a battle with this layout. And the Serpent's Fangs do represent Harad's tankiest unit of archers, you know, the ones that are capable of skirmishing back and forth with the enemy, and yeah, poison projectiles as well. Routing could be an issue for Dol Amroth here, we shall have to wait and see. Further around we have the rest of his army, which is going to be approaching from the south with the support of some of his allies, some more Southron warband here, yet more of the unupgraded dismounted Serpent's Guard, more of the Southron archers, more of those Serpent Guard that we've already seen, more Southron pikemen, more Hashari Shadows as well, the mounted rangers, which in the new version of the game as it comes out, they are going to be the class of unit which managed to keep hold of body-piercing projectiles. With how effective a tool that is, it is a really powerful thing that Harad are going to keep hold of, but for this version of the game, of course, it's nothing too special, though, again, the mobility in a map as large as this is going to be useful, though the fact that the map is so large and open does mean that rangers may not be the be-all and end-all. We'll have to wait and see. More Hashari, more Southron pikemen, more Serpent's Fangs, and you have the standard Serpent Guard as well, so they're going to be a little bit more difficult to use, and they will need to be babysat a little bit more than the Black Serpents with their second hit point and slightly better charge bonuses. But I will relent a little bit in this version of the game, and especially with custom scenarios that do build themselves around this kind of unit a little bit more. Single HP cavalry can be a little bit more useful than perhaps I gave it credit for, but I would still say that it's not really worth the trouble if you had to pick your own armies, but that's by the by. This is, after all, a custom scenario. Tommy himself is going to be playing as another Harad army, this one going to be a bit more Muhard inspired by the looks of things. The Muhard warriors, more numerous, lower tier though than the Serpent Guard that we've already seen from 2 times his army. They do have a shield value, though again the lack of armour, lack of overall melee defence could prove to be a problem, especially when it comes to some of Dol Amroth's higher tier units, though more on that as we move through the defenders later on. More armour piercing, of course, in the Muhard Berserkers, even more woeful in terms of their defensive stats, however melee defence not really going to be too high on their list of priorities, and then of course you also have the armour piercing to boot as well. And just in behind we have some of the Muhard Beast Tamers as well, forming up a nice phalanx on the front line. Again, though, not armour piercing like the Southron pikemen that we have already seen. And the Muhard Beast Masters, this is a unit of javelin cavalry, obviously camel riders as well. Good at hunting down enemy cavalry, and considering it is Dol Amroth and considering there is room to play with, anti-cavalry is going to be important for the attackers here if they hope to keep Dol Amroth contained. And if all else fails, you can still use them as standard javelin men as well. Moving on to the next force, we have some Muhard warriors, more of the tribal look, and that of course means that the mighty Trollmen regiments are also going to be a part of Tommy's army, far and away really the most impressive and scariest part of the Harad lineup. Plenty of armour piercing damage going to be coming their way, or coming from them towards Dol Amroth I should say. And Dol Amroth will be susceptible to this sort of thing, though they do have some units which will give the Trollmen and their variants a little bit of pause at their higher end, but generally speaking, the Trollmen should be very, very efficient in this kind of matchup. We have the footbound javelins as well. The Muhard Beast Hunters maybe lack a little bit of the versatility that the Beast Masters on their camels have, but still going to be very, very useful here, those javelins. And obviously they do have an armor-piercing melee attack as well, though their melee stats leave a little bit to be desired. Just in behind, we also have kind of a difficult unit to use, I suppose, in the War Beasts of Harad. This sort of monstrous cavalry unit is shock cavalry, though that doesn't really tell the whole story with them. They're a curious kind of unit. I'll be interested to see how this kind of unit and perhaps a slightly more user-friendly Bjornings and the like change in the upcoming new patch. Still though, devastating charge. If they can get some good charges off into the Dol Amroth infantry, it's going to really hurt them. We have some more Muhard Berserkers, more Beast Tamers. Here are the mighty champions of Nathrat, the single strongest Haradrim infantry unit. Plenty of armor-piercing damage, very, very scary. Exactly the kind of unit that most factions are going to really dread fighting when they see Harad standing across the field from them. Though, in terms of outright damage output, the Demons of the Desert perhaps have them beat. Those javelins are one of the most deadly ranged attacks in the game. They may not have the ease of use of the Iron Watch of Miramir, nor the quick, devastating power of the Witchers, but they are in that same category of a unit which can turn a whole battle just by themselves, so that's why you often see them be the first choice of target for defending archers. More War Beasts, more Beast Hunters, and the rest is going to be, yeah, more Trollmen and more Muhard Warriors. Yeah, more Muhards as well over here, and yeah, more of the Beast Tamers, so yeah, the same kind of thing. The third Harad army is going to be T.S. Niehoff. I imagine this is going to be a similar army to what we saw on the other side, so yes, more Southron Warband, more Dismounted Serpent Guard, more Black Serpents, Mumakil at their centre as well, Hashari, Southron Archers and Southron Pikemen already firing away at the Dol Amroth forces on the walls. The Mumakil already firing as well. The ranged attack goes underappreciated, I think, for the Mumakil, because it does add up over a longer period of time if you allow it to. Southron Warband, Serpent Guard, Southron Pikemen, more Serpent's Fangs, more Serpent Guard, Dismounted Serpent Guard as well. Hashari, Serpent's Fangs, yeah, this is the same kind of army, isn't it? Southron Pikemen and Archers, so plenty of Southrons, and then with a few higher tier units of Serpent Guard and some cavalry in support as well. The final attacking army, attacking from the docks, is going to be the only Umbar army on the field today, though I think it's entirely made up of Corsairs. So we have Y2K, Corsair Savages, and as we saw a fair time ago at this point, with the Island Assault on the Corsairs, several of this class of unit now actually is not available in the standard version of the game. They're only custom units. Corsair Savages are another armour-piercing shock infantry unit which lack a lot in terms of defence, so that's something they have in common with the Muhard Tribesmen that we saw previously. The armour-upgraded Corsair infantry are actually a fairly decent multifaceted unit, though I think in the face of more elite Dol Amrothian forces they will still struggle, we'll see. Ranged attack is all well and good as well. Corsair Blackguards offer that punch that you need, and among the Corsairs they are actually the most well-rounded melee combatant as well, so the best of the pirates. And we also have the Corsair Pikemen, another unit that you cannot access outside of custom scenarios as well. Not probably the worst pike unit actually on the field today for the attackers. The armour piercing gives the Southrons a little bit of a leg up, I think. Corsair Savages, Corsair Infantry. Just in behind we have more of the Blackguards, more of the Pikemen as well. Here are the Corsair Fencers, which I think this actually would probably be the most well-rounded unit. They are an assassin unit. Maybe one of the more user-friendly units of assassins as well in this version of the game. You can see that this is where the general is as well. Looks a bit out of place actually. The Pirate King, as we shall have to call him in this one. Corsair crossbows are also very, very dangerous, though also very immediately exposed to Dol Amroth counterfire. There's going to be no hiding for them, at least not easily in this situation. A couple of units of them with more fencers, and then another clutch of savages, infantry, blackguards and pikemen. So a fairly well-rounded force actually, this from Y2K. It may be made up only of Corsairs, but it's got everything it needs to be a real pain for Dol Amroth. And then we move immediately on to the defenders, starting off with winged swordsmen. Tarnostian spearmen are basic western spears. They're going to be decent at holding a line, though in terms of dealing damage against Corsairs, with how low their melee defense is, probably going to be enough to do something, but Dol Amroth are going to have to rely on other things to do the damage. Fully upgraded Athalond men-at-arms will help to do that, though as we've already mentioned, certainly with the Haradrim, this is the kind of unit for which the armour upgrade, while it will help, it won't be enough to see them over the line without building their lines correctly first and foremost. Seraphim is another Dol Amroth force with more Tarnostian spears. Before we move on though, There's a couple of units of the standard Dor archer, well, one unit of Dor archers and then one unit of the swordsman up here as well. Maybe more of a town militia feel to many of the Dol Amroth defenders here, though both Harad and the Corsair dominated Umbar here are going to be weak to this kind of archer fire, though like we said it's going to be a quick battle. Tirithea marksmen heavier, they're going to be better at counter firing and of course more damage themselves and better in melee, so that will come into play later I'm sure. More Thalon men-at-arms. Halberdiers, armour piercing, not going to be too useful against Corsairs and Haradrim tribesmen, though a phalanx is always going to be useful for holding lines. Where they choose to build those lines is up to them. As I just mentioned, armour piercing not going to be quite so useful, but the Black Swan Renegades do still represent a good solid unit of line infantry that are going to be capable of holding a line. Haven Guard are here. We've got some Thalon men-at-arms just in behind as well. Perithil Riders, Belfalas Marines, so good unit of horse archer support for damage over a longer period of time, and javelins for damage over a shorter period of time. Some standard Doradern or swordsmen as well. They won't actually be quite as poor as you may think they will in this sort of matchup, because they will at least be able to trade back and forth with the entry-level Haradrim and Corsairs, though certainly not the sort of unit that can be relied upon. We also have Knights of the Silver Swan. They're going to have an updated unit model, which looks fantastic, honestly, in the upcoming new patch. So this may very well be one of the last times we get to see this old version of the unit, though the foot-based Talon Knights will still retain it. I think the cavalry will change, but yes, Lance Cavalry, single HP, though more heavily armoured than the Haradrim examples we've already seen. Ingamar, another Dol Amroth defender with civilians, so of course this is a town where people live, so civilians are going to have to try and take up arms to defend it. Thalon men-at-arms, halberdiers, more Black Swans, more Tarnostian spearmen, Perithil champions. This is the kind of unit I was waiting to see, because this is the kind of thing which is going to be really deadly, especially against the really lightly armoured Haradrim and Corsairs. Very high base damage, exactly the class of infantry unit that Dol Amroth do like to specialise in, and yeah, that damage is going to be really, really nasty. More Thalon men-at-arms, more Tarnostian spearmen, got some men-at-arms again. Doran or pikemen going to be effective at holding the line. Of course, I already mentioned the halberdiers and their armour piercing not going to be the be-all and end-all here, but pikes are going to be far more useful, especially if it does come down to pike-to-pike combat, though with how short the battle is, I doubt that will be for long. Archers, marines, Doran swordsmen as well. We do have the dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan here as well, so multiple HP, more defensive in nature, but still going to be able to outlast a good amount of the attackers today. The really deadly Arathirim of Dol Amroth, their stats make them far and away really the best unit of Lance Knights in the game, which is a distinction which they need to try and leverage to their advantage as much as they can here, because they could be devastating to the attackers even in spite of all the spears and polearms they have at their disposal. More Belfalas Marines, more Doran swordsmen. You can see how spread out this defence is. Civilians, plenty of civilians here. Tumihai, another Dol Amrothian defender, with pikes, with men-at-arms, with spearmen. That's going to be what this defence is based around, the bread and butter units that Dol Amroth have at their disposal. And more men-at-arms, spears, halberdiers. Some standard Swan Knights, interestingly enough, with their Zweihanders, so a melee cavalry unit. Could be useful if they manage to catch up to some of the Serpent Guard. I don't know if they would beat the Black Serpents one-on-one. Maybe if they caught the Black Serpents unaware with a charge as well. Tirithea marksmen, renegades, marines, men-at-arms, renegades, marines, and yeah, I think you get the point here. Tirithea marksmen, more Perithil riders, so plenty of fast movers. The cavalry is going to be interesting here. Keeping track of everything is going to be quite difficult, I think. But the archers are in position, and there's no need to wait, of course, with a battle like this, because we can get right underway with the forces already arrayed against one another. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So undoubtedly it's going to be the Corsairs here who are going to be getting involved in the action first, as they do not need to enter through the walls before they come into contact with the Dol Amroth defenders. Now, as we've already mentioned, the very spread out nature of this settlement is going to be one of the deciding factors, I think. If the attackers can get in and around the defenders and start making the battle more chaotic, it is going to be quite difficult for them, I think. However, in this part of the battlefield at the very least, the attackers are going to have to find themselves penned into a corner to a certain extent, as Dol Amroth do have the capability to hem them in pretty quickly. There is also the matter of the cavalry. The cavalry, I think, is also going to be one of the main deciding factors in this battle, purely because they have the room to operate in, which cavalry rarely does in a siege battle like this. We have seen cavalry be effective in sieges before, but maybe not as one of the, if not, clearly the most important type of unit that's on the field. But some of the archers from on high there. Corsair Savage is also going to be charging in to meet the Dol Amroth line in melee. Tarnostian Spearmen going to struggle a little bit against the various types of units that the attackers have at their disposal today, especially among the Haradrim that we've seen. But yes, Corsair Infantry in support. I think actually the Corsairs, in many ways, the best thing that they can hope to do is draw as much of Dol Amroth's attention as possible, as early as possible, and that should give even more room then to the Haradrim outside to start making their way in. Doranernal archers moving up onto the walls. Still, Harad not in any huge rush. I mean, we're only 500 frames into the battle, but they're not just moving their whole army in right from the off. They are trying to consider their options a little bit more to start with. The Black Serpents trying to escape into the open ground that the settlement offers, but it's not quite so easy to do that. Dol Amroth infantry making life a little bit more awkward for them. Parathil riders also moving in. They did actually manage to get the charge off there actually into the Thalond men-at-arms, so a little bit of damage done, but it's not an ideal situation this for the cavalry. As much as they are multiple HP, they are going to need to have a little bit more about them than this, and once again we're seeing the Dol Amroth cavalry being used a little bit more effectively, perhaps with the Hashari getting clattered by a unit of Swan Knights. More ranged fire coming in as well from afar. Tirithea marksmen starting to loop a few shots in. Swan Knights, like I said, should actually do decently against the Black Serpents, even though they are single HP, but I do think Dol Amroth will be hoping that they can use their cavalry against infantry as much as they possibly can. Ties Nihoff also starting to move in. Tarnostian Spearmen going to allow the Halberdiers to take the brunt of the initial responsibility anyway. In come the Muhard Beastmasters, going to be used as standard javelins for the time being, though I do think their anti-cavalry capabilities are going to be very important here, but for now they're going to try and use their javelins, but immediately they're going to be zoned back out of the settlement by the advancing spears. And the Beastmasters back up almost immediately. And then over here, of course, the Mumakil are another interesting wrinkle in this fight, but so far not being used right from the off, which is perhaps a good thing. Mumakil are surprisingly fragile given their enormous size and how scary they can be. Corsair infantry, it's actually kind of interesting to note that the Corsairs are not being heavily pressurised right from the start here. Maybe it's because of the pikes, so the cavalry cannot do much of the heavy lifting, and that's why maybe Dol Amroth backing off just a little bit. But Corsair Savages over here, the only ones to lurch forward, but the superior numbers of Dol Amroth and range support means a unit like Corsair Savages are going to fall away pretty darn quickly. And I think they are probably going to rout by attempting to be peeled off the front line. The Blackguards trying to use some javelins to thin out the numbers of these Dol Amroth infantrymen. Southron archers moving up in support of Southron warband, so 2 times trying to establish a bit of a beachhead in through this choke point as well, but again they can't afford to dawdle too much here, Harad, as much as setting yourselves up nicely is all well and good. As a result of Harad's lower armour values across the board, the longer they loiter, the more effective Dol Amroth's archer force is going to be. The quicker they get into melee, the quicker more of their armour piercing can be brought to bear. Single unit of Southron warband though already shaken, they need to be careful. That lower morale that this tier of unit often is stricken with could end up being a bit more of a problem. So we see another way into the settlement. There's so many ways in that you have to imagine one of them, Dol Amroth, might undercook a little bit. Our Beastmasters cycling back out as well, trying to give Dol Amroth something to think about. Once again over here, just a single unit of Southron warband being committed initially, which is not really going to be enough. I mean, they're definitely going to rout fairly fast. This is one of the examples of the Doranernal swordsman maybe being more efficient as well, even for a basic unit of militia. And then you've got the Halberdiers also. Not the sort of thing which this Dol Amroth force is going to enjoy facing. And then just in behind, in come the dismounted Serpent Guard. Southron pikemen still there. Still these projectiles getting looped in. Looking good for those Southrons, but again, maybe it's a result of so many entrances that Harad also can't use overwhelming force on some of them, but maybe concentration of force is going to be important moving forward. This is maybe a little bit more like it this. More units being committed over here, more of a presence, with dismounted Serpent Guard now moving forward to help the initial push, and also Serpent Guard managing to get a decent little charge there off onto a more exposed unit of Athalon Men-at-Arms under Ingamar's command. More pikemen and Serpent Guard as well. Even unupgraded as they are, they should be more than a match for especially the militia tier units that Dol Amroth do have quite a lot of, and they will be relying upon to do some of the lifting. So far Dol Amroth, even over here, where a little bit more pressure is being applied, is still doing reasonably well. And a large part of that surely is down to the fact that these archers, going to be difficult to keep track of all the damage that the Dol Amroth archers are doing, but as Harad move into the settlement, on the walls, the archers are getting the opportunity for really good shots. The Serpent Guard going to try and escape into the open field. Civilians represent a good choice of target maybe for charging into. Over here, more of a traditional choke point fight has started to establish itself. Defeat seems certain for the Dol Amroth swordsman for now, though as soon as the phalanx units get a little bit more involved in proceedings, that should be enough, especially in conjunction with these Tirathea marksmen as soon as they start firing at the correct targets. Some farmsteads just outside of the walls. Over here, meanwhile, you can actually see that the Dol Amroth cavalry, the terrifying force that is the Arathirim, causing havoc on the front lines, and this Dol Amroth front line is also looking very, very healthy indeed. Muhard Berserkers are moving in. And like I said, they should be pretty good against a lot of the Dol Amroth units, provided they're backed up in melee. Their own defensive value suspect, but the armor piercing definitely going to be useful, which is true of Harad as a whole. They're going to need more Southron archers. They need to make sure that those Arathirim don't get another opportunity to clatter into the side or the back of this Harad force, otherwise we're once again going to start to see the morale become more of a concern for the Southrons. Muhard warriors moving in as well, so numbers not really too much of a concern. War beasts of Harad moving forward. I mean, if they can get in behind enemy lines and start rear charging, that's the sort of thing which could start to turn the tide of the battle in Harad's favour. I should say in the attacker's favour, really. Corsairs still very much a presence. This is looking a little bit more like it as well. Tommy being very aggressive. Pretty much his entire force at this point is actually committed, so you would hope for the attacker's sake that some movement starts to be seen from them, and Dol Amroth are starting to look a little bit more fragile up front. Victory almost a certainty for the Dol Amroth, even though they are shaken. I think as the front lines get established, that may start to change. The war beasts of Harad in behind enemy lines as well. That's a very worrying sign, I think, for the defenders. Exactly the sort of high charge unit that you don't want to be seeing rampaging behind your lines, and also support coming in from the Beastmasters, the Javelins, Demons of the Desert. So this looking like a far more promising endeavour for the attackers. Meanwhile, over here, starting to see more of a commitment now from both sides to this fight. I think actually it's more that, well, I think Dol Amroth did move forward to try and take the fight to the Corsairs, but the Corsairs responded by committing pretty much everything into melee, and all of a sudden Dol Amroth's starting to creak in certain places. I think as much as Dismounted Knights of Silver Swan are strong, and they do have a little bit of support as well, pikes and crossbows, exactly the sort of combination which can lay many a unit low. See over here, I said at the start of the battle in the composition phases, the Parathil champions, two-handed swordsmen in general, key for Dol Amroth in this battle given the kind of opposition they're facing, but they do find themselves overrun a little bit in melee here in terms of sheer numbers. The crossbow bolts were targeting them just a moment ago as well. The upgraded Corsair infantry in high enough numbers to prove a bit of a problem as well. Dol Amroth did move forward over here though, and the formation is a little bit compromised for the Corsairs. Things looking a little bit dicey for them. The Corsair infantry doing its best to hold on. Will it be enough? A little bit further back, Belfalas Marines and civilians moving forward. Looks like the javelins have already been expended. Ashari shadows in behind enemy lines as well. A kind of body-piercing projectile is a little bit worrying. Once again, over here, how they were able to get in. Gaps being found by the cavalry, but not enough force being applied by the infantry to make this truly worrying for Dol Amroth, I would suggest. For now, the infantry is being kept in check, and it will continue to be so as well as long as the Haven Guard are here. Ashari can look after themselves, but not in this company. And then over on the other side, this rather narrow choke point, we see this kind of thing in many a siege. You could actually go through there, I think. Oh no, there is fences, you can. That would have been an interesting little workaround for them to utilise, but yeah, with the support coming in from the archers from the rear, halberdiers, Black Swan renegades forming up a solid front line. Harad struggling to make inroads over here, so a bit of a mixed bag so far, as maybe you would expect from a settlement of this size and scope. Javelins and throwing daggers being traded back and forth. Dol Amroth doing quite well for themselves in certain areas, but in others, down here I think at the south end of the settlement, we are going to start to see more and more of a Harad presence. So far Dol Amroth are doing pretty well over here. Tommy the Wise and 2 times being held at arm's length for the time being. Flaming shot being utilised. I think that's quite wise. We've seen the attackers suffer with their morale so far, though no mass routes. I think a combination though of flaming shot and pressure in melee is exactly the sort of thing that is needed to swing this particular fight in their favour, but it's over in this part of the battlefield, I think, where the worry will come for Dol Amroth. Belfalas Marines' defeat seems certain. More javelins being looped in. Plenty of routing, and the fact that infantry is now able to do their thing as well. Demons of the Desert looks like they've taken a bit of damage, but they're going to try and get around to the side here and presumably rip right through the dismounted Silver Swan Knights and Perithil Champions. And that would pretty much put an end to Dol Amroth's resistance there as well. War Beasts of Harad, I don't think they were able to get their charge off there. More of a clumsy bump into these Thalon Men-at-Arms, but it's also over here where more of Tommy's units, a couple of TS Nihovs as well, are starting to find purchase too, so it is starting to showcase its size, I think, this settlement, because as soon as Dol Amroth start to struggle in an area, it's more difficult for them to reinforce. For Harad, once they're set, they can simply move in and start pushing forwards as they will. But it is going to be difficult for them to do that over the long haul. Muhard Beastmasters charging in. The melee cavalry, of course, once their javelins have been expended, but the massive cavalry is enough to do much of the charge damage for them. Black Swan Renegades, I mean, it wasn't a targeted charge, so Dol Amroth infantry is going to catch up to them. Be a little bit careful with this cavalry, Harad. It is the key to their continued success, I think. TS does have more units over here, continuing to try and do damage to those Tirithea marksmen, but those marksmen have almost certainly done the business against Harad already paid for themselves. There's only 30 of them left. Those poison arrows. Dol Amroth, while their morale should hold together better than the kind of units they're facing off against, it's still a weapon that can be wielded by the attackers, but the poison arrows would need to be utilised a little bit more wisely than this, I think. But yes, we're starting to see a few more routes now. Saffron Pikemen showcasing their weakness in that regard. Meanwhile, northern end of the settlement, the attack from the sea. Civilians starting to rout, but that's kind of expected. Belfalas Marines. Excuse me. Of course, the Corsair Fencers in here as well should do pretty well against the light and medium units among Dol Amroth, and the Pikes are also starting to struggle a little bit here as well. Dismounted Knights, the Silver Swan struggling a little bit, but now coming in from the side, with some more overwhelming force, having been victorious on that choke point. Some reinforcements for Dol Amroth arrived, and now sweeping in. Can they be outright victorious against the Corsair force? That would be a very welcome bit of good news for Dol Amroth going into the latter stages of this fight. In comes some Corsair savages to try and stem the momentum a little bit, try and give a little bit more time perhaps for crossbow bolts and javelins to do some damage to this Dol Amrothian force. But for now, Dol Amroth looking fairly domineering, coming in from the side as well. Of course, this does mean that later on Dol Amroth will have units, if they are victorious here in the north of the map, to be committed elsewhere. Is that going to be enough long term? Over here we've still yet to see the Mumakil committed as well, which is something else Dol Amroth will have to be on the lookout for. If nothing else, it will cause front lines to lose their cohesion for a moment, and in that moment attackers could make something happen, though given the fact that the attackers have already committed an awful lot of resources to this fight already, as is the way with Tommy's maps, as we've mentioned, they do tend to be quite short and violent affairs. Following through from a Mumakil assault, I don't know necessarily how much they have left in the tank to be able to make use of what the Mumakil will be doing. Black Serpent's in here, but there's Halberdiers. I don't know if I'd be sticking around there for too long. Over here, the Serpent Guard managed to push through. Dol Amroth back behind, well, they haven't pushed through, but Dol Amroth have pulled back behind buildings to try and avoid ranged fire, I'd assume. Because Dol Amroth have largely been victorious against the Harad infantry force that was committed over here. Most curious. Serpent Guard in the background. Clatter into the back here of the Thalon man-at-arms. They do manage to do a decent amount of damage here. As much as Dol Amroth seem to be pretty dominant in this fight, they've allowed, again, another unit to get a little bit of a leg up on them there. A little bit concerning, perhaps, moving forwards. Dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan. Again, still putting up some brave resistance over here, but they've lasted longer on this front line than I kind of expected, given the way that the tide was running there. So fair play to them for that. It's no surprise that it is some of Dol Amroth's stronger infantry units that do still remain. Evidently, the Demons of the Desert were not able to get into the exact position they would have wanted. Otherwise they would have been evaporated, but now moving forwards, civilians are retreating. War Beasts of Harad still making a nuisance of themselves. It's not an absolutely overwhelming infantry force that's been victorious over here, but the fact that attacking units are now going to be running through the streets, running rampant, that is perhaps a cause for concern. Both units of War Beasts still back here. Uhard Berserkers. Kind of victorious over here though, Dol Amroth. Dol Amroth have been winning by minor margins, more fights than they've been losing, I think. It's just whether or not that now that there is this kind of unit rampaging through the city streets, whether they can withstand that, or whether that proves to be their undoing. We shall see. Through their marksmen. Elsewhere, not much left over here. As we've already said, Dol Amroth, I think they did have more over here, but they siphoned them off to try and wipe away the Corsairs on the docks. Halberdiers and Haven Guard have been in melee for quite a while at this point. They're still reasonably healthy, but with Serpent's Fangs, who are no slouches in melee, all that remains of Harad over here. And still, though, there's still range support coming from those Tirithea marksmen up on the walls. And that has proven to be a real thorn in their side, as of right now. Over here, Oof, there goes one of the generals. I think he got headshotted there. Ah, the Mumakil are on their way forward. Was that a Mumakil arrow that killed that general? Well, just having a cursory glance, the Corsairs very much surrounded in the north at this point. Still drawing a lot of attention, but nothing else to be done from their perspective, I think. But we're starting to see now Mumakil starting to get bloodied almost immediately, as you would kind of expect, given how much of a strange unit they are. Forward they come, and linking up with some of the units that are already in here. Of course, if they leave it too late to use the Mumakil, they won't actually be terribly useful. Mumakil, of course, do have that absolutely devastating melee attack as well. It's just a case of whether or not the AI elects to utilise it. Very, very odd unit to try and use. If you keep them moving, that's the key to using Mumakil in this version of the game. They are far more fragile than they look. Not as a result of their stats, of course, but it's just how the game works. They're massive, they're going to take a lot of damage regardless of what you do. So they need to have like loads of hit points and huge stats just in order to be able to survive a few hits. There goes another defending general. Worrying signs for Dol Amroth that their generals are starting to fall like flies. Defeat is a distinct possibility for the Black Swan Renegades, as you would expect. That's their melee attacks, actually, that we are seeing. So that's pretty cool, although you can see already, even as a result of a pocket of resistance, the Mumakil start to fall away. Anyway, before Mumakil were coming into the settlement, we were going to take a closer look at what was happening to the Corsairs, though in the time that has happened it looks as though the Corsair force has been almost completely extinguished here. There's a few units still putting up some brave resistance. Corsair fencers will take a little bit more killing than many of the other units up here, but again, the fact that Corsair crossbows are now being engaged in melee is a bad sign for the pirates. But as I said, Y2K's job at this point is simply to try and tie down as much of Dol Amroth's force as they can here in the north, and allow Harad, with the momentum that they now will surely gain by units like the Mumakil and cavalry moving through the centre of the city, that will be enough to carry them to victory. Corsair blackguards. Good hits from the javelins. Still some crossbows actually with ammunition over here, so damage still to be done between these javelins and these crossbow bolts, which that is where the Corsairs have a tendency to be at their best, acting in support of what is usually a black Numenorian corps of infantry, though now they can only rely upon themselves, thrown upon the Dol Amroth lines. Meanwhile, over here, you can see the Mumakil loitering with intent just outside the walls over here, but this seems to be less fertile ground for an attack than not. There's another defending general. Again, they can't afford to be losing this many generals, I don't think, because surely morale is going to be something of a concern moving forward into the latter stages. Still putting up a good fight in this choke point, to be fair, the attackers, but the defenders still reasonably comfortable. Haven Guard are still in here. Black Swan Renegades have still got range support as well. Bad news for the Southrons. Over here, yeah, as a result of everyone going off to face the Corsairs northwards, eventually Harad have been able to force their way through here. It's cost them quite a lot, but they won't mind. They are now in. And there's still clean-up happening here in the south. Mumakil starting to funnel their way northwards. Are they going to get the support they need to be a problem? And still Trollmen. It's a bad sign when you're relying on Doran Ernil archers and very battered pikemen to stop the advance of Trollmen. And they do rout, rather unsurprisingly. In come the Serpent Guard as well, galloping forwards for a charge. Decent charge as well by the looks of things. I think that was enough to rout that unit of Belfalas Marine. So we are starting to see more routing now from Dol Amroth's perspective. More and more as this battle goes on, starting to see more encouraging signs for the attackers. Harad and all the strengths they bring to bear going to be a problem for Dol Amroth to deal with if unit cohesion becomes more of an issue. The Serpent's Fangs shooting not actually at those of Thalon's men-at-arms, interestingly enough, looping their shots over the buildings. Black Serpent's still very healthy as well, actually. Another good tool to be utilised. Seraphim still has a clutch of men-at-arms over there, though I'm not entirely sure what they're going to be doing. They look a little bit isolated to me. Further this way, these Parathil Riders attempting to do. They're just being used as a makeshift infantry unit at this point. I mean, considering it's Southron archers in melee, it's not honestly the worst idea, but again, this is one of the few areas of the battlefield now where I think Dol Amroth are still in the ascendancy. Get my words out. Well, there goes the Umbar general. The Pirate King falls. Things looking still dicey over here, although to be fair, actually, between the Corsair Blackguards and those crossbow bolts, it's looking more like the Corsairs are actually being victorious over here, with a little bit of support coming in from Hashari Shadows. That can make a big difference very quickly, actually, with those body-piercing projectiles. The Pirates may actually end up being victorious here in the north, which is a bad sign for Dol Amroth. I think with that news, I'd be very surprised if the defenders were able to go on to successfully defend their city. But we shall see. Corsair Blackguards proving to be a tricky customer to deal with. Still a few units, but at this point, every time I see a Dol Amroth unit moving forwards, moving towards the action, it's always a single unit that's very battered and bruised. I think that's the final defending general as well. I think the Rumor Kill there with their melee attack. One of the 4 Imra Hills there, absolutely demolished. And you can see that this is the result, really. I don't think these cavalry units, they were just sort of sat there, I would assume, and the Rumor Kill came up to them, and then the melee attack did fire. And so far, you have to say, these Rumor Kill have been used very effectively. There's still one more unit as well to be utilised, which is kind of heartening to see. It's rare that we get to see the Rumor Kill, and even rarer that we get to see them used well because of their shortcomings. Unfortunately, on this occasion, that has not been the case. Well, victory a distinct possibility still for Dol Amroth, but they've committed a lot to this fight, and I mean, Harad is still going to be able to stand and fight for a little while yet, which is worrying for the others. Means that there's going to be surely some sort of well, I think the domino effect has already been happening throughout the battlefield, and that's merely the last domino that will fall. That one unit of Thalon men-at-arms that was in reserve now being committed forward. I mean, I don't know if they will actually. With cavalry support, I don't think that this unit of Serpent's Fangs will be dealt with either, so that will be another victory that maybe Harad can cash in. Forward come the Serpent Guard once more. Lances down. Another fairly hefty collision. Again, though, single HP cavalry like this, they lack the charge bonuses that the higher tier cavalry have as well, so it's not going to be quite as devastating as if the Black Serpents were doing it, but still. Speaking of which, there's still just these small pockets of Dol Amroth resistance that we're seeing throughout. Still Trollman, Tommy the Wise's army did take a lot of damage in making the progress he did, but this was the first front line I think that Dol Amroth started to falter on. And from there, in all fairness, while there has been support between the various attacking armies, largely independent of one another, the Dol Amroth front lines started to falter a little bit. Perhaps committing all those units to try and defeat the Corsairs in the north and then not being able to do so. It is also entirely possible that in a settlement so vast, Dol Amroth simply got lost within it a little bit, and we can see perhaps, you know, one of the evidence points here is that all of these small battered units charging across the field are the attempts to reinforce, and they simply arrive too late because of the sheer size of this battlefield. One of the Harad generals does finally fall, maybe too little too late though, as the Mumakil, the second unit of Mumakil, start to move forward. Dol Amroth still at their strongest over here, so the Mumakil going to try and, if nothing else, disrupt. Elsewhere, really much else in terms of cohesive battles going on. I guess this one over here, Dol Amroth probably will finish off the Serpent's Fangs with the support of that unit of halberds, but cavalry still buzzing around, and I'm sure other units will be around to help deal with that sort of thing, though perhaps finishing Dol Amroth off is going to be a little bit more of a drawn-out affair, once again, because of the size of the city. Over here, still Corsair Blackguards, still cavalry running around. Here are the Mumakil now, in melee. Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. I think actually it's probably about time. Went up to 1 speed now that it's more of a scattered affair. I mean, the Mumakil are in behind enemy lines. They didn't do tons of damage there, they just sort of bulldozed their way through, as you would expect. Melee attacks being employed there as well. Tarnostian spearmen. Imagine being a unit of 9 spearmen and being tasked to try and bring down several Mumakil. I mean, they're going to be a disruptive element here, surely. You can see that the Dol Amroth forces now are also shaken and wavering and various things to that effect. As long as they keep moving, this is going to be a bit of a concern for Dol Amroth. It's almost comical when you see that happen. But being in sustained melee is not really where the Mumakil want to be, because the Haven Guard, with their very high damage values, would make fairly quick work, actually, of a unit like the Mumakil. Defeat almost a certainty. Seraphim's army largely routing there. Not all of them though, the Haven Guard do remain. I thought that was him admitting defeat for a second, which would have been a bit of a shame, but it is not. Parathil Riders still running around the settlement. Is that going to be how Dol Amroth end this fight? Are they just going to try and hit and run as much as they can with the cavalry? Still a few pockets of resistance here and there, and it is going to be... I mean, the cavalry was a factor in this battle, most certainly. It wasn't the be-all and end-all like I was kind of thinking it was. Here in the late game it probably will be, but more as a result of it needing to be the clean-up crew for the few defenders that remain. Excuse me. Well, cavalry still charging in and out. Starting to see more routing from the Athalon men-at-arms. So finally here in the late game, morale is proving to be in high demand for the men-at-arms. All of those general losses for Dol Amroth. All of the Dol Amroth generals died before a single attacking general fell. Or, no, actually, did the... I can't remember which way around it was now. It was only like 5 minutes ago, but I can't remember if the horseback general for Dol Amroth that died at the Mumakil's hands died before or after the pirates general did. Either way, the overall point still stands that the general situation for Dol Amroth was far worse than it was for the attackers. And while morale hasn't really been the thing which has ultimately stopped them, it would have been more of a factor as well. It would have been something else that they would have had to grapple with. The initial unit of Mumakil from TS Niehoff is still here as well. The other unit of Mumakil still making a real nuisance of themselves over here, which is... I assume the only thing that's left over here now is a couple of Haven Guard. I mean, I say a couple, there's still 54 of them. Mumakil are now also in here, which actually is a bit of a problem, because the Mumakil are that rarest of things in this game, where their bodies do actually have a physical presence, so that means that they do actually represent barricades now on this street, which is a problem, I guess, for both sides, but more so for the attackers if they want to simply finish those Haven Guardsmen off. Serpent's Fangs over here, and yeah, I think Dol Amroth, while things were looking good for them in places, that choke point over there where the Haven Guard are, had it been left to its own devices without extra support, Dol Amroth would have won that one. But that's the only fight that they would have won throughout the battle. Every other fight went the way of the attackers, even the one in the north where they committed more resources to, which is a sign that how they decided to divide their attention and resources was probably a little bit wrong. And as soon, they may very well have noticed that as well, but as soon as you realise that in a settlement of this size it's more difficult to correct that. It is what it is, though. Beast Tamers and Beastmasters, I mean, that is it, surely. Thalon Men-at-Arms already gone. Shari Shadows running around. Just making sure there's nothing else within the settlement as the Mumakil, with their elephant trumpeting sound. 2 times his Mumakil a little bit more battered and bruised as a result of their encounter over here, but it is going to be this which is the last fight on the battlefield, so fittingly it's the Haven Guard. Far and away Dol Amroth's most impressive infantry unit. Victory is almost a certainty for them. 34 of them, so they are taking more damage, and once again it's actually the Corsair Blackguards leading from the front. Impressed with them in this battle. Very good multifaceted unit then. You don't often note how decent they actually are in melee, because in comparison to the higher tier, heavier Umbar units, they are obviously not quite as strong. But when you put them into context like this, in this battle, you actually see that it is one of those units that genuinely is able to fulfill multiple purposes with their javelins first and then as a melee combatant second. Mumakil trying to get through the bodies of the fallen, finding it a little bit difficult to do so, but ultimately the battle is reaching its conclusion. It's closer in terms of percentages than you would think. I mean, like I said, as a result of pretty much every front line going in favour of the attackers, but maybe very marginally in each case. So it is a close battle, but it's one of those situations where when you watch it in series like this, you always, especially from the mid-game when you started to see Harad in the south start to gain traction, you're not too surprised by the outcome, but a close one nonetheless. Difficult map to defend as well for Dol Amroth, like I said. Its sheer size makes it an unwieldy beast to try and grapple with, and that's the sort of thing which attackers can more often take advantage of. And the Mumakil have actually shown themselves to be less fragile than I was fearing in this battle. Though it's easy to say when the battle has reached this point in particular. More cavalry coming in as well. Black Serpents still almost completely healthy. And that's going to be that. Well played. And the settlement falls into the hands of evil. Another launching off point to maybe push further inland. But yes, as I was mentioning, we can't actually see the players' names. The only one we know for sure is Y2K, as a result of him being the only Umbar army on the field. But I think deserved, like I said, all of those frontline engagements for the most part, other than this one over here, had it not been, had reinforcements not come elsewhere from the attackers, that would have been the only one the defenders would have won outright. Every other one went the way of the attackers, and it's always going to be very difficult for the defenders. Like, momentum is very key, even though the percentages ended up being very, very close in this battle. Once the momentum was in the attackers' favour, it was always going to be quite tricky for the defenders to reverse that, given the size of the settlement, given the fact that they needed to consolidate a little bit more, because when things started to slip through their fingers, it was always going to be difficult to try and regroup in a city that is this large. But they gave it a good go. And I do feel as though with a little bit of tweaking to their plans here, the defenders could very well have won this. It wasn't a battle that was always going to be super hard for them to win or anything. It was just going to be judgment calls that ended up deciding the battle overall, and the attackers made slightly better ones. And also the good fortune of killing off the Dol Amroth generals in series pretty quickly also certainly helped matters, because it would always have made the morale situation a little bit more tricky to deal with as well. But let's see what did the damage for the Harad armies then. The Black Serpents doing very, very nicely for themselves, 472, as well as the Serpent Guard and the Mumakil. So mounted units on a settlement of this size, perhaps unsurprisingly, being very, very important, and no other units in this Harad army actually. Well, actually, no. Serpent's Fangs and Hashari Shadows. So infantry, less of a concern on a battle this large. Cavalry and archers, however, much more so. As for the second army, Muhad Warriors getting 113 kills. It's not bad for a unit like them. Beastmasters, another mounted unit, 200 kills. Javelins, and then charging into melee. Beast Hunters, look at all those Muhads. Champions of Nafrat and Demons, I think this was Tommy's army then. More Muhad Beastmasters doing very well actually, the Muhad Beastmasters, utilised well. And the War Beasts are a difficult unit to use, but one of them getting 283 kills is a good return from them. Monstrous cavalry like that has got a really good charge, but as I mentioned in the composition phase, they're a difficult unit to use, so fair play for that. Another example of cavalry being king in this battle. Dismounted Serpent Guard, Serpent's Fangs doing nicely, of course, and Poison is always something that you have to take into account as well. Hashari Shadows of 414. I think that was the key unit that actually did allow the Corsairs to win in the north, so a little bit of peripheral support from all the attackers working in tandem nicely, and obviously with cavalry it's easier to operate and reinforce your allies in a settlement of this size and scope, so not too surprised perhaps. The Hashari really struggled, the dismounted Hashari, as a result of being thrown in against stuff like Haven Guard with Halberdier support, but someone has to be the fall guy. Black Serpents maybe less so, but then they were only committed late on. We saw them pretty much full health, and Serpent Guard doing nicely. So yeah, cavalry very much king for the attackers on this occasion. As for the Umbar force, like I said, Black Guards and Corsair Crossbowmen, the ranged support that they had was also very key from themselves, as well as the Harad ranged support from the Shadows that we already mentioned. As for Dol Amroth, their cavalry did pretty well early on. I thought Swan Knights and Haven Guard, I don't know what happened to the Arathirim. They were around and then all of a sudden they weren't, so clearly they were disposed of by Harad at some point when we weren't looking, but that would have been a big loss for them. But yeah, an interesting kind of battle this, so big thank you to Tommy for sending it in. Always glad to have more new maps to showcase. Like I said, I don't know if this one was made by the Womb Raider or by Tommy or by someone else. I know that there's one map that the Womb Raider made but Tommy sent me, so it could be any number of battles at this point actually, given the fact that Tommy has been one of the main providers of replays for me of late, so who knows, but yeah, kind of a different one this. It was a siege battle in many ways, but so much of the battle took place within the walls because of the size of the battle, or the size of the settlement itself. It reminds me actually of the old version of Pelagia, only it's not a game killer. That version of that particular map as well took place largely within the settlement also. Tends to be a trait of most cityscape maps like this, to be fair. It does allow map makers to have a little bit more of a tailored experience, I think, a cityscape, rather than a more traditional siege where the walls are destructible and climbable and all of that sort of thing. You're more able to control the flow of a battle how you want it to be if you make a cityscape rather than a walled settlement. But yeah, one of those things. Interesting. I've also got to try and find a settlement within Dol Amroth's borders that this would fit the billing to actually call this one, because it was merely called Dol Port, which yeah, means I've got a little bit of free reign, I suppose. Dol Amroth isn't the biggest place either, so there's only going to be so many names I'm going to be able to give this one, I think. But yeah, big thank you to everyone involved, regardless of who made this one, and Tommy for sending me the battle replay anyway. As for what's coming up soon, I do have a couple of custom scenarios. I've got a couple of new maps as well as actually some classic maps that we haven't seen in a while. I think actually the very next battle that's coming out may very well be a battle on rebuilt Osgiliath, because it's been a little while since we've seen Osgiliath, and then we will move back into showcasing a few of the newer maps as well that people have shown. And by the time this one comes out, I'm sure that we will be marching ever closer towards the new patch. I've heard, like, a very loose sort of target month is May. And by the time this replay comes out, I think it's going to be late April, so it should be right around the corner. And that does, of course, mean that there will be that crossover period where I will still be posting up battle replays from this version of the game, in conjunction with stuff that's going to be being brought out for the next version of the game. So there will be that period, but yeah, it is what it is. Especially given the fact that I will likely be away for work intermittently, recording in advance to an extreme extent like I'm doing at the moment is kind of the only way I can approach things to make sure that my channel and the content are future-proofed to a certain extent, but yeah. Anyway, enough of my rambling. It's the sort of thing which I have repeated time and again at this point. But yeah, good things ahead, I'm sure, for Reforged and for this space in general. But again, big thanks to all the players. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.